I didn't even read what that said. So don't, you can share your thingy from Facebook to your page,
Okay.
but don't listen to Facebook because there's a delay.
Okay.
So just watch the Zoom. And we are live on Facebook. Hi, I'm Victoria Bruce, and I am the publisher and producer of the Arundel Patriot. And this is the part 3 of a new series we have on the Arundel Patriot, where we go really, really deep into issues, and we're calling it The Deep. And we dive into things that we think are important. We've talked to Ellie Gomez about the state of COVID. He's a doctor who's local, and we take questions. We've talked about healthcare for all. Tonight, we're talking about a really hard subject that is such an important subject. It's I should say viewer discretion advised. It's not for children, but if you're tuning in, you probably know that. The topic is sex abuse of children in the Catholic Church. We are bringing you these very deep and difficult topics and important topics because we believe that information is power, and that if we can bring a light and shed a light on some of these things, that hopefully we can help change the system, the narrative, the policy, etc. We are all nonprofit volunteers that work for the Arundel Patriot. We're looking for people who want to join us as contributors, as well as we need patrons. So please go to the shop button on our Facebook page. It's up there somewhere. And that'll take you to our Patreon account, where you can subscribe for as little as $5 a month, which is just a tiny bit to help us bring you great journalism. So without further ado, I'm very, very happy tonight because I'm bringing somebody who I have had the opportunity to work with over the past decade. Not as much as I would like, but Joelle and I go way back to, how old were we when we met?
Gosh, I think it was maybe I was 1. We were like 4 or 5 when we moved to Flower Street.
Yep. So we're both from Santa Ana, California. This is Joelle Casteix. And we had lost track of each other for some years. And one day, I think it was my father, he said, "You can't believe what Joelle is doing. She's all over the place." And she had become the biggest, loudest voice, taking down the Archdiocese of, was it Orange County or LA?
It was Orange County Catholic Diocese, yeah.
Orange County Catholic Diocese. So, of course, at that point, I had to track her down and say, like, your stories are incredibly important. And being a storyteller, I said, I have to get to know her, and try to work with her to bring these stories out even more than Joelle does. But you've done an amazing job by yourself in the last decade. I see you all the time, everywhere. Joelle has literally covered the globe, taking down child sexual predators. I mean, that's not an understatement. That's basically your job. Like, I don't know anyone else on earth who has this for a job. I'm super impressed, beyond impressed. And you've done so much good, and you've helped so many survivors. And you have a new project called the Zero Abuse Project, which I want you to talk about. You're a published author. You're a mom. Like, who does this, right? When they're a mom too. You have a super successful TED Talk, 2 books. One book, tonight we're going to do a giveaway for the first 10 people that subscribe to the Patreon. We're going to give away Joelle's book called The Well-Armored Child, A Parent's Guide to Preventing Child Sexual Abuse. This is a very good book. I bought it as soon as it came out. There are things to do and things to see, and not only your own child, but you have to keep your eyes out for other children as well. Joelle, I could talk about you all night, but I'm going to let you have some of the airtime and tell us a story. Like, just how does one become like the hunter of child sex predators?
Well, there are other people like me, but I'm in the business, so I know. Yeah, we don't have a trade association, but yeah. I started doing what I'm doing because I didn't see any other way that I could live my life where I felt I had integrity. When I was in high school, at Mater Dei High School in Santa Ana, California, I was sexually abused by the choir director there. And he took advantage of me for the same reason and because of the same opportunities that all predators target kids. I was vulnerable. I didn't have a good support system at home. I wanted adult attention. I wanted mentorship. But what I didn't want was to be sexually abused. Now, the sexual abuse is one thing, but I came forward pretty soon, like a couple of months after the grooming started. And grooming is how a predator tricks a victim into thinking child sexual abuse is okay. And during this grooming process, I came forward to a vice principal at the school. And she told me that this is what love is. And if I said anything, I would end up back in a psychiatric institution where I had been a year before because of my vulnerabilities and suicidal tendencies at the time. So I was shamed into silence. And by the time the abuse ended, it took 2 years. And when I graduated from high school, I was pregnant and had a sexually transmitted disease. And the school knew, and they did nothing to stop it. And when my parents found out, they were equally as unsupportive. They both blamed me.
Can we say, I mean, can we just jump in and say what year this was, Joelle? So we can,
well, don't mean to date myself. Between 1986 and 1988. So it was before the scandal really blew up. And I was between 15 and 17 years old. So I told my parents, they blame me because it's very intrinsic in Catholic culture. And we could talk about this later on, that the woman is always to blame in these kinds of situations because it's a very male dominated society with a lot of misunderstanding about healthy human sexuality. And so I struggled for a long time. And, I was very self-destructive. I was suicidal. I had a bad marriage. I went through jobs. I did all kinds because I was so lost. I felt so worthless. I felt so discarded and thrown away. And finally, in my late 20s, I realized I had a choice. I was on a trajectory. And that trajectory was I was going to die unless I did something to change it. And I made conscious efforts and I got my act together and I worked towards healing. But in 2001, a scandal broke out in the Diocese of Orange. This is before Spotlight. My high school principal was sued by a former student for sexual abuse. And the kid, a guy named Ryan DeMaria, he's a friend of mine now. All he did was say, he and his parents went in and met with the diocese and said, we just want money for a lifetime of counseling. And the diocese basically said, go pound sand. So 5 years later, that case settled for $5 million. And we got the exposure of documents, including the St. Luke's Institute, which is in Silver Spring, Maryland, the cover up at the school, the cover up at the diocese. And so when that happened, I'm like, I got to do something. And it was a roundabout way. First, I worked with the diocese and I realized they were just using me as a beard, so to speak. I was a public relations ploy. And then what happened was the state of California opened a civil window for victims, which meant that for a 1 year period of time, older victims, and at the time I was only 32, this is 2003, could come forward and use the civil courts to expose what happened. And so I did. And I filed a lawsuit and the diocese denied it happened. The man who sexually abused me denied it happened. The school denied it happened. But when all was said and done, the case was settled in 2005, I got more than 200 pages of documentation in my case. And it included the signed confession from the man who sexually abused me. And he confessed to abusing me and abusing other girls. There were letters from the administrators saying they knew about it and covered it up. And there were letters from the diocese saying that they knew about it, but I had emotional problems. So my allegations and the pain should be discounted. And that was at that point where it's like, you know what? I got nothing to lose. My story's out there. I'm out there. I have a duty and obligation to make sure that what happened to me never happens to another child. Because, as awful as my story sounds, I'm really one of the lucky ones. I made it and I've repaired relationships with my dad. I have a supportive husband and a great kid. I have all the tools I need to be able to carry the banner for those who don't. And there have been numerous times since 2002 that I've said, I'm packing it up and I'm going to go be an aerobics instructor. But I can't, because then something happens and somebody covers up these horrible crimes. And I'm of the opinion that child sexual abuse happens everywhere. We know that. But the secondary true evil, one I think can be more damaging, as it was in my case, is the cover up. The cover up and the marginalization of victims and silencing them so that they're powerless to stop the cycle of abuse.
And that is something that I see all the time, all the time. And I think the reason that this topic is so important to me, and I followed your work so closely for so long, and, love it when there's a spotlight with things like Spotlight. I do feel that it should be the Joelle Casteix show out there, and hopefully one day we can produce that together. But when you say like the secondary trauma, I know so many people that have come to me and we've talked, and I was a rape victim myself at 18 and was afraid to tell my parents because I didn't want to hurt them. So we just have such a bent mentality around that, being victims. And there are so many other people that have told me that they told a parent or told a friend about childhood sexual abuse and that nothing was done. And they still were told that they needed to see their abuser. Yeah. And so that kind of trauma, that, like, first of all, you have the immediate trauma of the rape or the sexual assault or the sexual abuse of any type. And then the feeling of insecurity, like you're never safe, because even if you do tell the people closest to you, in some cases, no one, like your parents, they weren't there for you. I mean, so how do you get beyond that? I don't even know.
Well, and we don't teach people what to do. And so, and I'm going to plug this because it's free on my website. It's a free book called The Compassionate Response. And what it is it's just like 16 pages, and you just read it and it tells you what to do when someone discloses to you. Because what happens is that someone isn't going to disclose to you when it's convenient for you. They're going to disclose to you when they're in trauma. So it's going to be at a wedding, a family gathering, holidays, a funeral, and it's going to be weird, and you're not going to know what to say, and you're not going to know where to point them. And so I encourage everyone here, just download it off my website and just have it, because you never know when someone's going to disclose. And we come from this weird puritanical background where women are always blamed. We're always telling women, oh, this is what you need to do to make sure you're not raped. And well, how about maybe men just shouldn't rape? So it's about changing the conversation. It's about showing people how to report. It's about telling survivors they're not alone. And it's about encouraging survivors to talk. Because when I first started talking in 2002, 2003, nobody wanted to listen. And people were embarrassed that I was talking. They were ashamed that I was talking. They thought that maybe I would cause more problems. I was, told shame on you. And now it's totally different. Not completely different, but very different. And it's just because more and more people are talking about it. We're normalizing the conversation. It's not a normalized behavior, but the conversation needs to be normalized.
Right. So I'm going to ask Yasmin, who's producing tonight and watching the stream. We're taking questions for Joelle. If you have any questions, if you're a survivor, if you know other survivors, or if you just have a comment, please comment in the live stream and we will try to get to your question. And also, Yasmin, can you put Joelle's website up there in the comments as well, so people can find it? It has a wealth of information. One of the things that's on there is this new project you have called the Zero Abuse Project. So give me a little idea of what that means, because I love the idea of zero abuse, and how are we going to get there?
So it's a nonprofit based in the Virginia area. And what it is it's dedicated to eradicating child sexual abuse in all its forms. And what we did was we were able to adopt a bunch of programs that are already in place. So we didn't start from scratch. Some of our programs include child first forensic training. So we train people in the field right now how to conduct forensic interviews on children. in a safe, trauma-informed way. We have the CAST program, which is a Child Abuse Studies and Training, which is an undergraduate minor or certification that's offered in, I believe, 65 colleges and universities across the United States. And it's a supplement for anyone who goes into a first responder field. So if you're going to be a doctor, you have a minor in CAST, a lawyer, anyone who deals with children. So you learn how to respond correctly and in a trauma-informed way when it comes to children who have suffered from child sexual abuse. We also have the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, which is it was founded, for those of you who are podcast fans. There was that podcast Into the Dark by Madeline Barron a couple of years ago. The first season was about Jacob Wetterling, and he was found, he was kidnapped and sexually assaulted and killed. And his family decided to turn that tragedy into something that can help other kids. So they do body awareness and sexual abuse, kid-friendly child sex abuse prevention training in schools. So we do all kinds, and there are other programs too. I could talk for days about it. But so all these programs have come together under the Zero Abuse Project. And then we also have an AI tool that we're working on. I've been fortunate enough to present at the UN about that. And we're working on other programs as well to expand our services, especially in this era where we have so much sharing of child sex abuse images over mediums, even like Zoom.
Right. So I want to bring it back around. I think, you know, a lot of us saw the Netflix documentary, The Keepers.
Well, if you live in Maryland, you have to watch it.
Oof. Yeah, if you're a Arundel Patriot viewer, you probably live in Maryland. Hopefully we have, I know Joe Bruce is watching. Hi, Dad. But I found that almost unbearable to watch. The abuse that happened to these children, the sexual abuse that is, if you haven't watched The Keepers, it's a hard one, but I knew about these stories because of you, because you had told me. But you know, we're in Annapolis, and that's Baltimore. And the way when you talk about the AI project, that there's really no way to track all of the ways that, you know, maybe you could encapsulate what The Keepers is and kind of what's Maryland's response? How have we handled that? We have this huge, you know, Catholic church scandal. It's been Netflixicized. Everyone knows about it. So are we stopping it? You know, what's Maryland doing?
Well, there are a number of big takeaways that we can take from The Keepers. Number one, Maryland is a very Catholic state. It's very much in bed with the Catholic Church. It's been that way since day one. Even though we like to think there's a separation of church and state, the Catholic Church wields a great deal of power when it comes to legislative reform. Also, when it comes to affiliations between the police and the church, and prosecutors and the church, and other law enforcement entities in the church. So The Keepers was a 7-part documentary on Netflix, came out in 2017, 2018, and it talks about the murder of a woman named Sister Kathy. And Sister Kathy was a young nun who taught at then Bishop Keogh High School. Now I believe it's Seton Keogh High School, an all-girls school at the time. And after she disappeared and showed up murdered, people thought, gee, something is going on. And they believe that it's because she was about ready to blow the whistle on a child sex abuse ring that was going on at the school. And so this takes us to the next big takeaway from this. And that is that the Catholic clergy sex abuse scandal affects women, girls, just as much as it does boys. Because the main perpetrator in this documentary, a guy named Father Maskell, came from a school where he had had allegations of sexual abuse against boys. So they sent him to Bishop Keogh, and he just took advantage of the opportunities that were presented to him, which were girls. So people say, well, the priests have more opportunity with boys and this and that, but that's not the case. Girls are just as readily victimized. Something else that this points out is one of the key victims. She's Jane Doe. Her Her name is Jean in real life, and she was silenced and gaslighted for a long time, made to feel that she was crazy, made to feel that, she said, swear Father Maskell made me go and see Sister Kathy's body. And then they said, no, 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 there's no way, you're crazy. And then they found out, no, she's not crazy. Sorry, my lighting's weird. And so it shows how survivors are continually gaslighted and shut down. So much so, and it caused her husband so much pain that Jean believes that, he swallowed so much pain, her husband, that he died of esophageal cancer because of it. And the final takeaway, and I think is the most important, is that the Keeper shows the power of average folks, people like me, people like you, scrappy, other scrappy journalists, stuff like that, in finding out the truth about abuse and cover-up. The main characters in this documentary are average, everyday Bishop Keel graduates who loved Sister Kathy Sesnick so much that they wanted to find out what happened to her. So they got together with researchers, they formed a Facebook group, and they got together to figure out what is going on. And they use the power of the internet and their brains to get to the bottom of it. So we still don't really know what happened to Sister Kathy. Sorry for the spoiler, but we do know this. We know that Father Maskell, who was the priest perpetrator in this case, was the chaplain for the police department. So we knew the police department was never going to focus where they needed to, which is on the survivors. We know that the various other law enforcement agencies, the district attorneys and the state's attorneys, were very beholden to the Catholic Church. And so they didn't pursue things the way that they were supposed to. And it goes so far as to having Father Maskell bury documents in a graveyard. But again, nobody bothers to look. Nobody bothers to take that effort as a member of law enforcement to help the survivors. So it was our big hope that after The Keepers came out, that we would finally have serious legislative reform in Maryland. It's very difficult if you're a victim of child sexual abuse in Maryland, unless you were abused on the Eastern Shore under the Diocese of Wilmington, which is Delaware, and there's a separate set of rules that apply to you. And we really hoped that something could be done. And unfortunately, in 2019, there was a big legislative push to start and implement a window for victims like I had, and like we've now seen in Minnesota, New York, and New Jersey, and Delaware, that allow older victims. And when I say older, I mean you're only in your 30s to expose what happened to you. And to do that, you have to be able to hold the institution accountable, because institutions cover up abuse and institutions keep files. And institutions are the ones who should be held accountable for this, as well as exposing the perpetrators. So in 2019, they tried to pass legislation, and he came up with horrible opposition, and it did not pass. So right now, the statute of limitations in Maryland is age 38 against the perpetrator, which of course it's useless. You're not going to sue a priest without being able to sue the people who pay and protect him and facilitate everything going on. And age 25 for the institution. But I'll tell you, when I was 25, I wasn't ready to come forward. We're still cooking. We're still trying to figure out who the hell we are and what happened to us. So that's what's going on in Maryland. And so for any real legislative change to happen, it requires a serious grassroots effort on behalf of the people of Maryland, and a big power play in the legislature, because right now the Catholic Church holds the cards, and it's time for survivors and the people to hold the cards.
I feel like one of the things that always sticks in my mind is, when you were kind of starting your journey and really out there for the first time, you were getting a lot of harassment. I remember even talking with you around some of our parents' friends, like, oh, she deserved it, or, that kind of comment from women. And then, years and years you've done this, right? You've found out a credibly accused sexual predator goes and gets moved to a different school. And you take your flyers with his name on it and the accusations, and you go and you pass them out to the cars of the parents that are leaving. Hey, just so you know. And what's their reaction?
I have not done one of those recently, and I need to get back to doing it because it's easily one of the most effective ways to get the word out. Because what happens is that 50% of the people will just take the flyer to be polite. I always take a flyer because I pass them out. I might as well take them. 20% of the people are going to be outraged. And the reason that they're outraged is one of two reasons. One, they refuse to believe, or two, they're a survivor or their kid's a survivor. And it's a weird dynamic, and I really can't explain it. But the people who were my biggest critics, my most vocal critics, my most hateful critics, usually end up being survivors or the parents of survivors. And a lot of times it's because a parent doesn't want to believe that this could possibly happen to their kid. You know, you hear, oh, well, father so-and-so used to spend the night in our house all the time and he never abused my kids. Or the survivor themselves isn't done cooking. And so they're not there yet. And so when I get people who are really angry, I always have to, you know, come from a place of love because I don't know where they're coming from. But yeah, I mean, they, especially in very insular communities, if you have a parish that is primarily Spanish speaking or primarily Polish speaking or Italian speaking or, you know, they're just very upset that Joelle the white girl is coming up and saying this guy was an abuser at your parish. And I get it. I totally get it. Nobody wants to believe that. But when you're able to show them enough evidence, it's like, you know, so yeah, I'm Joelle the white girl, but what's this white dude who never spoke a word of Vietnamese in his entire life doing in your parish? You tell me. You tell me. And why did he spend 6 weeks in Maryland? I'll tell you why. Because he was getting treatment for sexually abusing kids.
So yeah, there's another story, right? So tell us about what is it, the Franciscan?
Oh no, it's the St. Luke's Institute.
The St. Luke's Institute. And that's in where in Maryland?
In Silver Spring.
Silver Spring.
Yeah. So there are numerous church-owned treatment facilities in the United States and all over the world. The two most famous are the Servants of the Paraclete, and they used to be in Jemez Springs, New Mexico. So if you ever have meet a priest wherever, they're like, oh yeah, I was in Jemez Springs, New Mexico on vacation. Not a vacation. And the servants don't operate in the United States. Anyway, I think they have an outpatient in the United States, but they're in the Philippines and I believe in the Caribbean now. So what has taken their place is the St. Luke's Institute. And the St. Luke's Institute began treating priests who prey on children in the early 80s. They started as a psychiatric mental health facility, Catholic run, that was able to treat priests because the Catholics are very insular. You don't want your priest going to Betty Ford where he could spill secrets to people who aren't Catholic. And so the Institute was founded to help priests and others through difficult times. Alcoholism, depression, anxiety. You know, it's hard to be a priest. You have no support system. So starting in the 80s, they realized they had a quarter of their beds were being filled by child sex predators. And so since then, they have become the premier treatment facility. I mean, if the statute of limitation opened up in Maryland and survivors who were sexually abused by priests who spent time at St. Luke's were able to access the information they have, it would be explosive. Because, and people say, well, what about HIPAA? This is a medical facility. Well, when a priest is sent to St. Luke's, and this is the problem, the priest doesn't raise his hand and say, I'd like to go to St. Luke's. His bishop sends him. So the priest is sent and they go for an evaluation. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's a month, and a report is written on this particular cleric. That report is not shared with the cleric, it's shared with the bishop. So HIPAA is already violated. They've already sent it off to a third party. And that any treatment plan has to be approved by the bishop. So if St. Luke says, Father X says he's abused kids and we think he's still a risk, but Bishop Y says we think he should be back in the parish, Bishop Y wins. And St. Luke's doesn't do anything about it, even though they claim to be mandatory reporters. St. Luke's can say, we believe this guy's in denial. And there's just, they're in many ways, they've rendered themselves powerless, but they have a lot of power because all they have to do is pick up the phone and say, this guy's being sent back to you. So if anyone does a Google search on the big predator in their area, predator priest who's been exposed, and St. Luke's, chances are that predator spent time there and was evaluated there. And what St. Luke's also says is they have very rigorous aftercare and monitoring programs. So Father X goes through treatment at St. Luke's and he's sent back to, his diocese and Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis. And they say, great, we have this wonderful aftercare program set up and he's going to be monitored and it will be great. No aftercare, no monitoring. Oh. In fact, there are satellite St. Luke's facilities in other areas. One is, we call it Recon, and it's in right outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And that's where they house the untreatables, the worst of the worst. Rumor has it that Cardinal Theodore McCarrick is there. A bunch of bad perpetrators that I've had to tangle with, such as Gerald Funchen and Robert Briette. Now, one would think this has got to be a lockdown facility. Got to be locked down. No, just a bunch of apartments. They have their own cars. They do their own shopping. Wow. Nobody knows who they are. And they just go out and do their thing. And they will find a way. Because we know that, this was I was lucky enough to do a 3-day presentation for the state of Hawaii on how to help survivors of sexual abuse. And one of the presenters is a guy who treats sex offenders. And there are very few people who do it. And there's very little success. And he says the only way you can get success is, one, you waive confidentiality. So if the husband is a perpetrator, you have the wife and the kids, and everybody goes to all the sessions and everybody knows what's going on and holds this person accountable. Wow. Another thing, the person has to have a support system. They have to have friends who know they have a problem and who say, let's find healthy outlets for you. Why don't you take up running? Let's do this. Let's go out with adults. Let's form healthy adult relationships. And they said, you're not cured, but at least you're managed. Priests never have that because they never have that transparency. They're never allowed to go to a group of their fellow priests and say, I need help. It's always, this is our little secret. It's always a quid pro quo because, Father A is not going to say anything about Father Perpetrator because maybe Father A has a girlfriend or maybe Father A has a kid. So there's horrible quid pro quo. So it's a losing proposition all around unless there's serious systemic change. And that has to start with places like St. Luke. It can no longer be business as usual.
Let me take a question, Joelle. I've got a couple coming in. One of them is, and you might have just alluded to part of that, but as far as in religious organizations, we know it's not only in the Catholic Church. Is it worse in the Catholic Church?
We know about how bad it is in the Catholic Church because they are meticulous record keepers. And they had a lot of hubris for a long time and were taken down by some serious lawsuits. The Boy Scouts, we know it's horrible in the Boy Scouts, but the Boy Scouts didn't have the kind of control over their leaders that the Catholic Church did. And there's a lot of overlap. A lot of the priest perpetrators made sure that they were the Boy Scout chaplain. We know there's a horrible problem in the Mormon Church. We know that to be a bishop in the Mormon Church, you're basically chosen by your stake president. They said, hey, God said, I think you should be a bishop. And so now you're a bishop. So these bishops hold one-on-one interviews every year with teenagers. They're called worthiness interviews. And to become an adult in the Mormon Church, you go through these interviews. Now, on the surface, it seems like it'd be okay if the parents were there, if the door were open, if there were 3 or 4 kids in the room. But these interviews are done one-on-one behind closed doors with an adult male and a kid, and there are explicit questions asked about masturbation, sexual activity, orgasm, all these things that just offer, and it doesn't mean every bishop's a predator. It means that if you are a predator, being a bishop's a great idea. And they're not trained. You're just made a bishop. So you could sell shoes, you could be an accountant, you could do whatever and be a bishop without any kind of pastoral training. So there's a huge problem in the Mormon church. And a wonderful pioneer named Sam Young, who's in Dallas, he was a former bishop in the Mormon church, has really put a big light on what's going on there and has forced a little bit of change. But because the Mormon church, again, is so insular and is such their own community, it will really take change from the outside to make that happen. We know sexual abuse happens everywhere, but we know that the cover-up will be greater in secretive organizations that are primarily male-run. Because, I mean, yes, women do abuse, but at a exponentially lower rate than men. So if you have a male-dominated, secretive group that uses forgiveness and the gates of heaven as an impetus for approval, you got a problem. So you're going to see more of it in religious organizations. Jehovah's Witness is another great example too.
Wow. Another question. What is the metrics for when the church decides the predator is fixed?
Well, that's the thing. There is no metric, and you can't be cured, so to speak, of being a child sex predator. We haven't figured that out yet. Therapeutically, within that community, within any community, we haven't figured that out yet. So for the church, they are really good at getting rid of people who are troublemakers. So if you are a priest predator, but you also have homilies that may not toe the company line, boy, suddenly that's your metric. If you are a priest predator who also happens to be busted stealing money, you're out. But remember, predators are the most engaging, charismatic, outgoing, friendly, popular people out there because they're the ones who attract the kids. So that's why when you hear, Father so-and-so has been removed from the parish, and the parishioners like, no, he'd never do that. He's so wonderful. We love him. All the kids love him. He would never hurt a kid. And so it's very difficult for the church to have that kind of metric. And even if they say this person is terrible, because of their belief that once a priest, always a priest, it's very seldom that someone will be totally cut loose. So if you are a priest predator and you've been arrested and convicted and jailed, when you're out of jail, chances are you may no longer be a priest, but you'll have an annuity in your name that's paid to you every month. That happened in the case of Oliver O'Grady from Deliver Us from Evil, another great documentary that you can see on Netflix, I believe, because it behooves the church to keep these guys close. Because even though Father O'Grady abused a lot of people, he has a lot of dirt on the people who protected him, including Cardinal Mahoney.
So tell me more. I know I tried to say we were going to talk about Maryland, but this is such a global scale. I know you've been to the Vatican protesting, you've been to Alaska, you've been to Guam. We talked about St. Luke's. What can people do, Marylanders? I know that, because of the law, this window that you talk about. So they open it up and they say, okay, until you're 50 years old, you can still have a civil lawsuit against. Can you explain that better? And what do we need to ask for in Maryland so that victims here can be on par with other states and that, the church can be held accountable?
So it was very rare for a state to open a second window for victims until California did this past year. And I was lucky enough to be the survivor who testified on behalf of that bill. Because we know that when the first law passed in 2003, the people who came forward in 2003 are very different than those who will come forward now. Because it's after Me Too, after the Pennsylvania grand jury report, people are like, oh my God, it's not just me. So in Maryland right now, until you are the age of 25, you can come forward and file a civil lawsuit against the person who sexually abused you and the institution. Now, criminally, there, I believe in Maryland, and I'll have to confirm, and we can post this on the page later, that there is no statute of limitations on the criminal side, but criminal is insanely hard to prove. Whereas, like, even though I had letters that in my file that said, my name is Thomas Hodgman. I sexually abused Joelle, got her pregnant, and I sexually abused these other girls. That would never have shown up in a criminal trial because those were documents that belonged to the diocese. And so I never would have gotten a criminal conviction. So you have until age 25 to come forward against the perpetrator and the entity. You have until age 38 to come forward against the perpetrator. Now that's virtually impossible to do because, first of all, the perpetrator is not going to have all the files that show what they did to you and how it was covered up. But the institution that enabled that perpetrator will, because if a predator is just sitting on a park bench handing out candy, they're not going to be very successful to acquiring children. They have to have an institution. They have to have a medium to get access to kids with credibility. So we have so people you can't go against the individual perpetrator because there's nothing there. Also, you have to look at the reality of the situation. If I came forward at the age of 32 and said, I just want to sue my perpetrator, no lawyer would take my case because there's, what do they get? His car, and there's nothing there. So it really is, our society really only understands money as a way to punish people civilly. And to get to the meat of the matter, and to get to the cover up, and to get to why throughout the state of Pennsylvania, priests were moved all over the place, and why in Delaware, the exponential number of perpetrators was huge because Delaware was a dumping ground for predator priests. You have to be able to go after the institution. So what can people in Maryland do? Well, number one, it's education is first, because people don't understand the difference. They say, well, you passed a law 2 years ago. The church says they've changed. I'm not sure. The church hasn't changed. The law passed a few years ago is ineffective. So what we need to do is get people motivated, tell their lawmakers, this is the way it's going to be, and get a power play together that's more powerful than the church is right now. The church's power play is immensely powerful. They can go in and they can get meetings with any legislator, with the governor, anyone they want, and they can throw their money around and do really, really bad things for survivors. So what it'll take is survivors and advocates and parents and those who don't want predators dumped in their schools and churches to stand up and say, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to play that same power game and same power play. And it's, in California, our newest window includes public and private institutions. It's very easy for Maryland to do the same. And you'll hear excuses about sovereign immunity and repose and things like that. That can all be overcome. It can all be overcome. It just requires people to stand up and demand it.
So one of my favorite stories is the end result. And I saw you post on Facebook one day, and you've been fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting for your perpetrator to be exposed. And before Me Too, nobody was talking about it. Can you tell that story?
So when I came forward and filed my lawsuit in 2003, it named the Diocese of Orange, and it named the man who abused me, a guy named Thomas Hodgman. At the time, Thomas Hodgman was an assistant professor of music at a small college in Michigan called Adrian College. And I made sure they had access to the lawsuit. I told my attorney, make sure they know everything, so on and so forth. So they do nothing. And in the press, and you can look this up, the man who abused me said, oh no, Joelle is crazy. Her claims are bogus. This never happened, so on and so forth. And again, if you gaslight a survivor long enough, I'm like, oh, maybe I'm crazy. Am I crazy? I swear there were other girls. So the case settles. It's 2005, and I have all these documents. Signed confession, the cover up, the fact that they said, we will not say anything if you go away quietly, that kind of stuff. And so I take this to Adrian College, and the president of the time was a guy named Stephen Crane. And I remember sitting there, and it was me and a friend of mine, Claudia Versalotti, who's a Spitfire advocate out of Toledo, Ohio, and then Stephen Crane and his attorney. And Stephen Crane and his attorney basically told me that it was just sour grapes on my part, that I was upset that my teacher boyfriend broke up with me, and that due to the remoteness of the abuse, they weren't going to do anything. I'm like, dude, was I abused on Mars? Hello, it's California. I mean, so he was allowed to keep his job. Not only was he allowed to keep his job, he was promoted. So during the course of the next, so that's 2005, now fast forward to 2018, it's 13 years. That's, yeah. And so he gets promoted. He's now head of the music department. He now heads all of the choirs. He is head of the union on campus. And every few years, I stand up and say, this happened to me. This is the proof. I had it up on my blog. It was all out there. And the school would always issue some stupid statement saying, Joelle's crazy. This didn't happen. It was a long time ago. We stand behind Dr. Hodgman. He's doubled the size of the choir. He's this, he's that. Yeah. Oh, and I would get hate mail. Gosh, maybe 2015 or 16, I got reams of hate mail from students saying, well, because I sabotaged their choir tour because they were touring with a high school, and I sent all the information to the tour company in the high school. And boy, I got a lot of hate mail for that. And because the kids, college students and high school students they have the short view. They don't have the long view. I was the same age maybe as their parents. They're like, that was a long time ago. You need to get over it. We want what's going on right now because their timeline is so much shorter. So Me Too starts to happen. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, and granted, throughout all of this time that in the 13 years, I did a TED Talk. I wrote books. I was teaching at UCI Law School. I mean, I'm not like living off the grid in Alaska eating bugs. I mean, it's seriously, I am beyond credible. And so Me Too happens, and I'm like, you know what? I know that he will not send former Mossad agents after me. So I got it better than the Weinstein victim. So I'm gonna write an open letter. And so I did. And I said, you know, this is my Me Too letter. This is what happened to me. He's been allowed to keep his job, so on and so forth. And I showed it to my husband, Mike, and I said, Mike, what do you think? And he's like, Joelle, just be ready for crickets. Nothing's going to happen, just like nothing has always happened. And he goes, it doesn't mean that it's no reflection on you. That's a reflection on how bad all those other people are. So I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to promise I won't let my feelings get hurt. And so I posted it, and it was like a Sunday night, and then I didn't get online for 24 hours, so more than 24 hours. So Tuesday morning, I open up my Facebook and my blog, and I have like the blog post has like 25,000 shares. I'm like, oh. So it raised a stink, and it really started with the students. There were a lot of students who, it's funny, I'm friends with them now on Facebook, of all places, who were like, we're not comfortable around him. We don't like working with him. Why has she been silenced all this time? We don't understand why, you know, he can't have a relationship with a student, yet he sexually abused high schoolers, and that's okay. And then there were all the other rumors that there were other victims at Adrian, which of course I don't have any substantiation for. So I got a nonprofit in Adrian to reach out to me called the Red Light Initiative, and they dealt with sex trafficking and other sex abuse issues. And they said, well, we want to take you as a cause. And so they stood up and held up signs and said, he has to go. And there's a lot to be said. Like, there's a difference between me going to Adrian or a couple of other clergy sex abuse survivors going to Adrian who aren't from Adrian, or a bunch of locals standing up and saying, this has got to end. This is no longer acceptable. And so I didn't hear anything. And then all of a sudden, I noticed that Thomas Hodgson was no longer the administrator of the Adrian College Choir Facebook page. I'm like, interesting. And then I started digging around more, and we found out that he was allowed to quietly resign. Now, I made sure that wasn't very quiet, informed the media, and did all that other stuff. But he, for a long time, was protected by the teachers union and used his power within the union to make sure that he was never let go. And so that's another thing I work for. Make sure that unions understand that, there's certain things you protect a teacher for and certain things that you don't. And, we'll fight for healthcare and fair wages. We will not fight for child sex predators. So he now says that he's happily retired, but he will never work because he had a children's choir, he did community theater with kids, and he won't be able to do that anymore. So all I had to do is do a simple Google search of his name and everything comes up, because this isn't a he said, she said. He said it and he wrote it down and he signed the paper. And that's not acceptable. That's just not acceptable. He should not be arrested.
Huge congratulations on that. I mean, when I saw that, I know how long you'd fought for that, and it made me so happy. I have one question coming in, and then I want to ask why most victims don't have your tenacity to keep fighting like that. But let me just quickly ask you, one of our viewers wants to know, is there a champion for this cause in the Maryland General Assembly that we should reach out to, that viewers should reach out to?
Yes, and you know his name better than I do. CT, what's his last name? We'll put it on the Facebook page.
Okay.
Yeah, his name is not right in front of me, and I am, and he's a survivor. He's in the Keepers, and he's been a huge fighter for this. Now, he's a survivor. He's taken a lot of guff as well. So whether or not he's a person who wants to continue to carry the banner, but he's the place to start.
Is that Senator Will Smith or?
No. Oh, God, I'm such a bad person for not remembering.
I'm going to ask my producer to find out. Yeah. Okay. So like I said,
answer is yes, and we'll get the information out.
Child sex abuse, I mean, it absolutely breaks people, right? It causes suicide, substance abuse. It's very, very hard to recover and be able to talk like you do and come out and fight 20 years. I don't know anyone who has your tenacity. What can we do to help them? What can we do to help other survivors come to a place?
Create an open space for them to talk. Most survivors will never disclose their abuse, and most of the time it'll be because they don't feel safe doing so. Most survivors come forward because they find out that the person who sexually abused them has hurt other kids. So create a safe space and environment for survivors to come forward and talk to your kids. Seriously. I mean, my son, he grew up, my mom's a sex abuse lady, but he knows, he's not a big talker, so he won't be the kid that kids disclose to, but he knows what he needs to do if it happens. And we need to stop being judgmental and just be accepting. And I think that's the number one thing. I got so angry because people said, well, what did you do? You must have done something. You wanted to teach your boyfriend. It's your parents' fault. It's your fault. It's this person's fault. All I wanted was for someone to say, I'm sorry. This wasn't your fault. And what happened to you was a crime. And that's just so important. And we help survivors get the help they need. You can find a lot of that in the Well Armored, or in the Compassionate Response on my webpage. And then you can also look up local numbers in your area and always know the child sex abuse hotline. And They're working on a survivor hotline as well, and they do take reports about adult survivors of child sexual abuse, and that's at 1-800-4-CHILD, and that's nationwide.
Thanks. And we'll put all of this good information in the comments. We just have a couple more minutes. Tell me one of the most amazing cases that you've worked on since you've been doing this work.
You brought up Guam earlier, and Guam is a really interesting story. I was sitting in my living room. My kid was maybe like 1 or 2. He's now 13. Phone rings, and it's this guy calling me. He said, "I'm on Guam. You know, I hear you help survivors. What can you do?" And Guam? I mean, the only thing I knew about Guam was that my brother-in-law was born there. I mean, that's all I knew. But he keeps having to put me on hold because he's a receptionist in the senator's office for the island of Guam. So we start talking, and come to find out that there's sexual abuse on Guam is rampant because you have a society there that has been colonized. Now the bishop is local, and he was a predator and formed this group that was able to protect other predators. Then they became a dumping ground. So I reached out to people that I knew in the movement. I'm like, "Hey, do you know any predators were sent to Guam?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, he went for vacation on Guam for 6 months." So it was a big dumping ground. So I went to Guam and said, "Let's see what I can do." And it was easily the most fascinating trip I've ever taken. I landed, and I was met by reporters at the airport. I was like, "Wow, what am I, the president?" And they came to my hotel, and we did interview after interview after interview. And each one of them said, "Joelle, it's not safe for you to leave the resort. You need to stay on the resort because your name's on a list." I mean, that's how powerful the church was there. And so I tried to have a couple of support group meetings to get other survivors. I told them to call me, to come. Nobody showed up because everybody knew and no one wanted to talk. But that was just the start of something. It was like the first domino that fell. And then all of a sudden, now by 2020, they opened a statute of limitations on Guam. More than 250 survivors have come forward to file sex abuse lawsuits. The Archbishop Apuron was ousted by the Vatican, is now living in hiding somewhere. And they've been forced to sell all these properties that were ill-gotten gains of, various people's little, their own money and so on and so forth. And so it has been a complete sea change. And, I'm not going to take credit for it because, I just showed up once and, raised a big stink. But it got enough people talking that it completely changed the role of the Catholic Church on Guam. And it fired up local Catholics. So every Sunday they were out protesting. Wow. And that's what made the difference. Joelle, the white girl showing up on Guam, I get it started, but it's the locals saying, "Hey, this is our church. This is our home. We live here," and protesting. And that's what really got real change happening there.
So it sounds like it needs to be something from within, right? It needs to be the parishioners. It needs to be the Catholics that do not stand for this. Are you still Catholic?
No. I mean, culturally I'm Catholic, but I don't go to mass or anything like that.
So do you see that coming out from people within the church? Are they demanding transparency, accountability? Are there movements?
I mean, I can go to Maryland and testify and do all this stuff, but I'm not from Maryland. It needs to be Maryland Catholics saying we're going to stop donating, period. It needs to be Maryland parents saying put public schools in this bill too. It needs to be survivors saying we're no longer going to do this alone. We have everybody here with us. I will definitely stand with them, but it has to come from within.
I love you so much. Oh, thank you so much.
I love talking to you. This has been so neat.
Yeah, I feel like we still have a project in us that we have to do one of these days, but it's so good. I created this new show, The Deep, because I'm like, I'm just going to talk about these things that nobody will let me talk about. And I just appreciate it so much because these things are so important. So Thank you for being here, Joelle. I'm just going to ask our viewers to, if you have any more questions, we'll have Joelle look through the questions and we'll put in all the data that she gave us. And I want to let you know that we are all volunteers at the Arundel Patriot. There are a bunch of shows coming up. On Sunday, you can watch STAR, that's Straight Talk About Racism. We have great success with a panel of all super diverse women talking about race. We're inviting men as well. If you'd like to be on that show, you can contact me at arundelpatriot.org. And we have tomorrow night Michaela Wilkes, who's running for Congress in Maryland's 7th District. And then next Monday, we have Chris Wilson, who wrote the master plan. He was in prison for life in Baltimore, but he got out. And I'm sure many of you have read that book. So you're going to love that interview. That's at 7 o'clock on Monday. And we got all kinds of good programming. We need you to donate. It's patreon.com/Arundel Patriot. Hit us up. Thanks, Joelle.
Thank you so much
for all the work you do. All right. I'll see you soon, I hope.
Okay.
Okay,
bye.
bye.